In the last lecture, we explored the many personas of Adolf Hitler, how he was presented to the world and the legacy of such representations. I had hoped to conclude the representations of Hitler by discussing the various ways in which his demise has been depicted and whether such depictions are appropriate. Unfortunately, we will not have time to do so, but I will provide slides and readings about this topic along with last week's readings for those who are interested. In this lecture, we will look at a pretty significant event that occurred in the mid-1930s that proved to be a symbolic incident for a world that was on the brink of war. In 1936, Berlin, the capital city of Germany, played host to the Olympic Games. Ever since assuming power in 1933, Hitler sought to turn the Olympics into a showcase for his regime. It's reported that he set aside a budget of more than $30 million, roughly double the budget of the previous Olympics in Los Angeles. He ordered the construction of modern infrastructure, such as an enormous stadium that would show the world what Germany under his leadership was capable of. It was the first ever Olympics to be televised, as well as the first to feature the Olympic torch relay. Thus, Hitler saw the Olympics as an opportunity to show the world that Germany was back, thanks to the Nazis. But there was also something far more sinister at work than just the leader of a country trying to brag to the rest of the world. Nazi sports imagery served to promote the myth of Aryan racial superiority. So-called Aryan facial features, such as blonde hair and blue eyes, were accentuated in posters and journal illustrations. As we have seen in the last lecture, members of non-Aryan or non-white and Jewish races were perceived and portrayed as inferior and degenerate. In April 1933, the Nazis' sports office ordered all public athletic organizations to implement an Aryans-only policy. This prohibited Jews and other non-Aryans from competing in any sports in Germany. So, Hitler supposedly promoted these games as a springboard that would prove his theory of Aryan supremacy to the rest of the world. He even commissioned Leni Riefenstahl to film the spectacle, with an eye on the potential propaganda value which the games may have. The German government believed their athletes would dominate the games, with their propaganda led by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Gobbles constantly promoting athletes of African descent as being inferior to Aryans. Therefore, Hitler was furious when he learned that the United States of America planned to include 18 black athletes in their Olympic team. Nevertheless, the Berlin Olympics officially opened on 1 August 1936, and so began one of the 20th century's greatest sporting myths. 22-year-old African-American athlete Jesse Owens, representing the United States, entered the enormous stadium filled to capacity with an apparently hostile crowd. Son of an impoverished sharecropper and grandson of a slave, Owens struggled with several illnesses as a child. Therefore, he was considered to represent everything that the Nazis despised. Owens had also been the victim of racial discrimination in his own country, with his family moving from the segregated southern state of Alabama to Ohio in the north during the 1920s, and him experiencing various forms of racial abuse while in college in Ohio. But this is conveniently overlooked. On 3 August, Jesse Owens won the gold medal in the 100-meter sprint track event. On 4 August, he won gold again in the long jump, beating Hitler's blue-eyed boy Lutz Long. Owens then went on to win the 200-meter sprint the next day. On 9 August 1936, Owens won his 4th gold medal as part of the USA 4x100-meter relay team. It was an incredible feat. Owens became the first American of any race to win 4 gold medals in track and field in a single Olympics, and remained so until 1984. According to the narrative of Owens, through his accomplishments, he single-handedly defeated Nazi beliefs in Aryan superiority. As a result, Hitler became furious. As the most common variant of the story goes, after Owens won his first medal, Hitler, not wanting to acknowledge a black man's ability, left the stadium, refusing to shake Owens' hand. Writer Al Siegel commented in 1936 that Owens' performance during the Berlin Games gave the world, and particularly America, a proper measure of Hitler. According to Siegel, the impression of Hitler dwindled and rendered the pomp and grandeur of his dictatorship to be only a myth. Now, it's an appealing story. It's appealing because it is good versus evil, and importantly, good triumphing over evil. Owens represents the ideals of sporting excellence, rising above adversity to realize his God-given talent. Hitler and the Nazis represent racial intolerance, white supremacy, and a regime hell-bent on world domination. Two opposing ideologies meet one another in the sporting arena, and the good guys win. Indeed, the Owens victories at Berlin was regarded by some sports commentators as the most important sports story of the century. However, by now you should know that there are always certain half-truths in any narrative. Things are not always as they seem. So, in unpacking this myth, we will discover its origins and discuss the power of visual rhetoric, specifically looking at how the narrative was created and refined in film. Visual rhetoric can be defined as the display of meanings through the integration of visual and verbal cues. Valerie Peterson argues that in the addition of a rhetorical dimension to images is achieved when they are ordered to suggest a particular interpretation of what is being shown in the image. These symbolic meanings are placed in a specific context that aids the audience in deciphering the rhetoric. This then guides them towards a particular interpretation. So, in essence, these meanings are, as Sonia Voss argues, presented to an audience for the purpose of communicating with that audience. Visual rhetoric draws on the audience's pre-existing values or perceptions to create what is called enthymemes. An enthymeme is a type of argument where one of the premises for an argument is either hidden or implied. So you only have one premise and conclusion. For example, logic will tell us that if A equals B and B equals C, then A should equal C. But with an enthymeme, the B equals C part is only implied and not explicitly stated. Visual rhetoric relies on enthymemes because the response from the audience is crafted by the implied message hidden within the image. The footage of Owens' performance is a good example of the use of the symbolic dimension of visual rhetoric as a means to build and shape communal identity and core values. But how does it do so? Well, it does so by constructing a myth. Mike Mulford argues that the Owens vs. Nazis myth began in the 100-meter final of the 1936 Olympics thanks to the modern technological advancements. He notes, "The footage is compelling, and its black and white aesthetic lends the imagery gravitas and authenticity. Owens is in the inside lane as the gun goes off, and the camera follows him as he rockets out to an early lead. He is a loose runner, legs churning furiously but arms relaxed, hands gently closed. Owens glides furiously through the tape easily, despite a late charge from fellow African American Ralph Metcalfe." Ironically, this image that started the myth was caught by the camera of Hitler's director, Leni Riefenstahl. Just as with Triumph of the Will, Riefenstahl was initially reluctant about covering the games. In her memoir, she recalled being approached by Karl Diem, the head of the German Olympic Committee, to film the games after the success of Triumph of the Will. She initially declined, again not because of her ideological objections, but because she thought it would be logistically impossible to film over 100 Olympic events. Gobbles, for once, agreed with Riefenstahl out of concern that a poor portrayal of the Berlin Olympics would reflect badly on the German Reich. However, despite her reluctance, Riefenstahl eventually agreed to direct the film. She decided that the film should be positioned around the celebration of the physical endeavor, beginning the film with an interpretation of the physical ideal of the ancient Greeks that transcend millennia to inspire the German games. Gobbles was not convinced by Riefenstahl's vision, but eventually he gave in and saw the film could be used as an extension of his propaganda goals. Olympia was released in two parts: Fest der Völker, or Festival of Nations, and Fest der Schönheit, or Festival of Beauty. It was the first documentary feature film of an Olympic Games ever made. According to Riefenstahl, her initial goal for the film was to present the beauty of the human body in struggle, but all of this changed once she saw Owens run. Riefenstahl stated in her memoirs that despite hundreds of athletes from around the world, Owens was far and away the athletic phenomenon of the Games. Cooper Graham records that Riefenstahl tossed her manuscript in the air after Owens' showing in his first 100-meter heat, shouting, "I'll need all the 100-meter heats for cutting. This is totally crazy." As a result, Owens received a disproportionate amount of airtime in Riefenstahl's Olympia. In fact, Riefenstahl reportedly ordered her crew to relocate a large number of the cameras around the field to capture the Owens' first medal victory in the 100-meter race. The resulting clip, showing Owens going out to an early lead and finishing with a significant lead over Metcalf, is one that is often shown in films about Jesse Owens or the Berlin Olympics. Unsurprisingly, the American film studios also steered most of their focus toward Owens. According to Mulford, the film reels for the Berlin Games featured his 100-meter win as the cornerstone of the contest. While other athletes from the US and internationally were mentioned in the film, in the reels, Owens' name was the only name that was consistently mentioned in the US reels. One Hearst Metrotone reel confidently announced, "Owens, the star of the Olympics. Negro Ace rolls up points for Uncle Sam. 100-meter dash time, 10.3 seconds, new Olympic record." Now, Uncle Sam is a common national personification attributed to the federal government of the United States of America. Owens was often the only athlete mentioned by name, and by implication, he was seen as the central component of the US team. The reels gave credit to Owens for America's cleanup in the track and field events, proclaiming that his name was headlined the world over. He was hailed as the star of the squad, or the Star-Spangled Brigade of gold medal champions, who participated in the complete domination of track and field. No other American athlete competing in the Games, black or white, was described with such enthusiasm as Owens was. But Owens wasn't the only African American star in Berlin, even in his own events. In the 100 meters, Metcalf finished just 1/10 of a second behind him to win the silver medal. In the 200 meter, black teammate Matt Robinson won the silver, 4/10 of a second behind Owens. Metcalf actually ran with Owens on the 4x100 meter relay team. In total, the 18 African American members of the US team earned 14 medals in Berlin, 8 of them gold, 1/4 of the US medal count. So the entire African American contingent took the Berlin Games by storm, not only Owens, but for some reason the press found its hero in Owens, and also not for all of his victories. Though there were references to his other medals in the long jump, 200 meter dash, and the 4x100 meter relay, it's his 100 meter win that was mentioned regularly. So, what was the deal with the studio's obsession with Jesse Owens? Can it be attributed to patriotism? That's a possibility, but it would not explain why other US athletes were bypassed, nor does it shed light on why and how Riefenstahl focused on Owens so overtly. For some reason, the footage of him running to victory resonated with audiences. The symbolic significance of audiences seeing him as an African American run to victory in the Olympics hosted by the Nazis suddenly carried with it the potential to broadcast an important ideological message. Now, the Owens footage worked for two very different audiences: those who abided by the ideology of American exceptionalism on the one hand, and Nazi apologists on the other. For American audiences, the footage of Owens' victories served as a celebration of American exceptionalism. Mulford defines this as the notion that the US is a nation set above and apart from all others thanks to an inborn superiority. In other words, this ideology puts America as being superior to other countries of the world, or having a unique mission to transform the world. The footage, whether it was the media coverage from the 1936 Olympics or YouTube fan videos, all show the same images of Owens running the 100 meters and shots of Owens smiling after his victory, followed by shots of the American flag being hoisted up. Some reels that showed the footage specifically referred to Owens as the US hero when discussing his so-called breathtaking superiority. It's worth mentioning that other American and international athletes did share some of the spotlight with Owens. However, those that featured Owens did so by mentioning his name, while not doing so for the others. Thus, the reels gave him more time and attention than any other competitor. As a result, Owens wasn't just a member of the US Olympic team, but he became the representative for the country. The rhetoric that taps into this American exceptionalism ideology stresses what Jeff Mutter describes as the elevation of citizen virtue over all foreign others, and instills American identity with an exceptional moral superiority. Messages that spring from this premise reinforce the superiority of the United States in any arena. In addition, the creation and collecting of myths, or what Robert Ivy and Oscar Gilner call the ensemble of myths, like Owens single-handedly defeating Hitler's ideology, supports US attitudes of national autonomy and superiority. In doing so, narratives such as the Owens story serve to reinforce preconceived ideas of audiences who are already convinced by the idea of American exceptionalism. In other words, for this audience, the message clearly serves as a visual depiction of their core ideology. For Nazi apologists, the Owens footage was irrefutable proof that Germany was a peace-loving nation, welcoming athletes from all over the world. The fact that a black man was actually allowed to compete in Berlin was an achievement in itself. And footage of him being adulated and applauded by a predominantly German crowd is evidence that Nazi Germany was full of goodwill and only wished to be friends with the rest of the world. With the filming of Olympia, Gobbles and his propaganda ministry wanted to portray Germany in a certain light. His goal for Olympia was to add imagery to the rhetoric and dazzle the world with Third Reich modernity and efficiency, as well as healthy goodwill. According to David Welsh, Gobbles wanted to present an image of society that had successfully manufactured a national community by transcending social and class divisiveness through a new ethnic community based on true German values. In addition, Riefenstahl attempted to transcend the divisive politics surrounding the Berlin Games specifically, and Germany more broadly, by focusing on Owens's athletic performance. Where the American reels positioned Owens as an example of American exceptionalism, Olympia located him in the 100 meters as a body in motion, removing Owens's political dimension and replacing it with a broader sense of athletic excellence. Riefenstahl centered the audience's gaze on Owens as an athlete, not as a citizen of a country. In the aftermath, Riefenstahl focused on the crowd, showing them standing and cheering earnestly, waving a number of unidentifiable flags before cutting back to a smiling Owens, seemingly embarrassed by the ovation. The audience shouted in support, standing and waving their arms as Riefenstahl cut to the scoreboard with Owens' time, and the US national anthem playing briefly in the background. It's clear Owens was the center of the film, celebrated for his remarkable athletic performance. Riefenstahl's Owens was not a political symbol, but the epitome of human physical potential. In reframing him in this manner, she attempted to transcend the political controversies that surrounded the games, and reposition the audience into a broader context than mere nationalist politics. However, the Nazis' activities since the games didn't help Riefenstahl or the rhetoric spewed by Gobbles and his propaganda machine. While Berlin looked pleasant enough for an outsider looking in, things soon started to boil over into state-sponsored violence, not only in the capital, but all over Germany. Following the games, aggression towards Jews and other minorities were escalating. Even before the games, Germany saw sweeping arrests of homosexuals, gypsies and Jews. As well as the accelerated Aryanization of Jewish businesses across Germany throughout 1936, which flowed over into 1937. This eventually culminated in the violent outbreak of Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, in 1938, which was the systematic attack on Jewish people and businesses in Germany by the Nazis. These actions were widely condemned by most of the world, but by the time Olympia was screened for audiences worldwide in 1938, the goodwill of the Berlin Games had all but vanished. A central theme of the Jesse Owens versus Nazis myth is undeniably the representation of race and racial attitudes. Owens, representing the progressive society of the United States, stood man alone against white supremacy and racial intolerance, which Hitler and the Nazis stood for, and beat them in their own backyard. But unfortunately, this is not true, at least not all of it. As we have already seen, Jesse Owens was not the only African American who did well in the Olympics, but the image of him winning the 100-meter final and his subsequent victories catapulted his name far above all the others as the man who would be the face of African American sporting excellence. Ironically, many African Americans condemned Owens' decision to participate in the Olympics, as they saw it as a betrayal of all oppressed people anywhere. African American publications, as well as National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, pleaded with Owens not to go, as it would be giving the Nazis the credibility that they were looking for. But the NAACP were not alone in their reservations of Americans competing in the Olympics. In fact, the body responsible for the US Olympic national team, the Amateur Athletic Union, or the AAU, considered imposing a boycott on the Berlin Games due to Hitler's discriminatory policies towards the Jews. The AAU president, Jeremiah Mahoney, argued that participation amounted to support of the Nazis, but he was narrowly outvoted after the American Olympic Committee head, Avery Brundage, insisted that the games were for athletes and not politicians. Owens himself considered the moral stance against Germany to be hypocritical, given that racial intolerance in his own country was very alive and well. Indeed, the performances of Owens and his fellow black athletes didn't change the minds of those who believed in white supremacy, in either Germany or in the United States. In their minds, there was no way for black people to win, no matter the reality. Stereotypes and hate were so deeply ingrained that any fact or fiction could be used to confirm them. If black people performed poorly, then that proved white people were superior. If black people were victorious, that proved that they had an unfair advantage as a subhuman race. When African Americans emerged as the stars of the track during the first days of the Berlin Olympics, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary that white humanity should be ashamed of itself. This was not because white athletes had lost, but because white governments had allowed black people to compete. When leader of the Hitler Youth, Baldur von Schirach, suggested to Adolf Hitler that posing for a photo with Owens would be good publicity, Hitler was apparently repulsed by the idea. "The Americans ought to be ashamed of themselves for letting their medals be won by Negroes," he replied in anger. "I myself would never shake hands with one of them." But while he never did shake Owens's hand, Hitler also did not shake the hands of any other of the gold medal winners, black or white, after the first day of the games. That's because on the first day he insisted on shaking hands and taking photos with only the German winners and a few Finnish winners as well. That night he left the stadium apparently due to a pre-scheduled meeting before African-American high jumper Cornelius Johnson won his first gold medal. Hitler was reprimanded, with the head of the International Olympic Games, Henri de Bellay-Latour, telling him that he could either congratulate all of the gold medalists or none of them. So Hitler chose to congratulate none of them. Owens initially denied that Hitler snubbed him. He apparently said, "I was on my way to a broadcast after winning and I passed his box. He waved at me and I waved back. I believe it was bad taste to criticize the man of the hour in Germany." William J. Baker, Owens' biographer, says the media made up the whole story as it would have perfectly fit Hitler's character to do so. Later, Owens eventually began saying that the snub actually did occur, apparently just to get the press off his back. It's uncertain as to exactly how the story of the snubbing could have gained traction, but given all the circumstances, it's unsurprising that it did. It fit in with the narrative that the Nazis were so vile and petty with their racial intolerance that they refused to shake hands with the #1 sports star in the world because he was African American, thus reinforcing the rhetoric that America, through Owens, represented good, and through his victories, he infuriated the evil Hitler. However, this narrative was has conveniently left out the racial intolerance that was being perpetrated against African Americans back in the US, not least of which were the Jim Crow laws. These laws were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by white Southern Democrat-dominated state legislatures to disenfranchise and remove political and economic gains made by black people following the end of the American Civil War. These laws would only be done away with in 1965 with the advent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Therefore, in celebrating Owens' victories, as well as those of other black US athletes like Metcalf and boxer Joe Louis, white Americans willfully discounted the racial realities of the United States at the time. White Americans ignored the hypocrisy of condemning Hitler's racial views while living in a segregated society themselves and having pre-existing bigoted views. Nowhere more was this bigotry evident than in US sports. At the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, African-American woman Louise Stokes, as well as T.D. Pickett, were on the verge to become the first American woman to compete in an Olympic Games. But they were denied from competing in the event, which was the 4x100 meter relay. Instead, they were replaced by two white teammates. Even on the way to the LA Games, both had been victimized. Stokes and Pickett were forced to sleep near the service area, separately from their white teammates. They had to eat dinner in their rooms, not in the banquet hall. And in addition, white teammate Mildred Babe Didrikson, who's often praised as the first American female athlete superstar, poured a pitcher of ice-cold water on both Stokes and Pickett on the train to Los Angeles. According to Damian Thomas, the curator of sports at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, it was apparently because Didrikson was opposed to having African Americans on the team. 4 years later, both women would be subjected to the same kind of discrimination on their way to Berlin. Stokes was again left out from the 4x100 meter relay, and while Pickett did compete in those Olympics, thus becoming the first ever African American woman to take part, she broke her foot in the semifinals of the 80-meter hurdles and was thus unable to finish the race. When African Americans did do well in their events, they were attributed animalistic characteristics to explain their athletic ability. Following the successes of African American male athletes at the 1936 Olympics, American assistant track coach Dean Cromwell claimed black athletes had an advantage over more so-called refined white competitors. Cromwell would explain, "It was not that long ago that the black athlete's ability to spring and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle." One of the few white American journalists to challenge the racism of observers from both Europe and the US was Louis Lyons, a columnist from the Boston Globe. He said, "The best the Nazis have been able to do with the racial problem created by Jesse Owens and co. is to theorize that these represent a race of American helots more nearly akin to the panther and the jackrabbit than to their Aryan competitors." He continued, "This is a view that conveniently disregards the fact that one of these colored athletes is a Phi Beta Kappa scholarship man, one is in medical school, one a law student, and the others are meeting the requirements of American college life." The bigoted comments, along with the fact that the Olympics were allowed to be hosted by the Nazis in the first place, illustrate an uncomfortable truth for what sports stand for or is able to achieve. To this day, many people believe that sports are inherently good. Any scandal is an exception to the rule. As Andrew Marinis writes, organized athletes cultivate positive attributes, including self-discipline, work ethic, and sportsmanship. Qualities such as fairness, respect, and morality are inherent in athletics, which goes the reasoning, and nowhere in life is the playing field as level for all participants as it is in the world of sports, where success and failure are determined, without favor, by one's performances. By appreciating the achievements of athletes from all ethnicities, religions, genders, and nations, we are brought closer together as one human race. There is appeal to the notion that even in a war-torn and hate-filled world, young people from all nations can come together to live and compete in peace. Unfortunately, as we have seen, this is also but merely a myth. The history of sport is tainted with dark episodes where athletes have been robbed of their potential and careers while the world was robbed of seeing unbridled talent because of what was happening away from the sporting arena. Now, it was inevitable that a story such as the one of Jesse Owens would be adapted into a feature film. Almost half a century after the Berlin Olympics, the two-part made-for-television biographical film The Jesse Owens Story was released. The film is largely shown as a backflash from the perspective of a black court-appointed investigator, Lou Gilbert, who interviews Owens after he's accused of tax evasion in the 1960s. In real life, Owens failed to pay $68,166 in federal income taxes from 1959 until 1962. According to historian William J. Baker, the error was probably not an honest mistake, as Owens believed his earnings were taxed too heavily by the government. In the biopic, Gilbert investigates Owens' past to determine the validity of the charges. To evaluate Owens' credibility and character, Gilbert interviews Owens and other key people in his life, such as track coaches Charlie Riley and Larry Snyder, as well as Ohio State teammate Mel Walker. The film juxtaposes these interviews with flashbacks from Owens' adolescence, his college career, Olympic debut, and his post-Olympic life. The producers promoted the Jesse Owens story as a tale of dignity. The film's pre-release write-up explained that the biopic is not just a screen biography. Instead, it's a tale of a black man's fight to maintain his dignity in a racist world, a dramatic look at a very special athlete who was dedicated to a country and a society that had no place for him. Jesse is the story of a human being who truly made a difference in the world. However, interestingly, Although they acknowledged the existence of a racist world in the description, the filmmakers suggested that racism was a problem of the past, solved through the progress achieved since then. However, as Lindsay Parks Piper and Andrew D. Linden argue, the overt racism of the 1930s had only been absorbed and adapted into the more subtle new racism of the 1980s, following the progress made after the Civil Rights Movement. The film credits white high school coach Charlie Riley with discovering Owens' talent, a common setup in sports films. White savior narratives such as the Riley-Owens relationship typically involve white figures rescuing characters of color, simultaneously exalting whiteness and diminishing the agency of others. According to sociologist Matthew W. Huey, the prevalence of white savior films that marginalize characters of color increases during moments of racial unrest. These relationships therefore appeared in the 1980s as powerful cultural devices in a time of unsettled understanding of race, racism, and racial identity. More than 30 years later, amid the last few years of the Barack Obama administration and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, filming began on the most recent biopic of Owens, entitled Race, released in 2016 and starring Stephen James as Jesse Owens. Unlike the Jesse Owens story, the primary aim of Race is to bolster the notion that Owens' victories shattered the Nazi myth of Aryan supremacy. Filmmakers therefore highlight Owens' time at Ohio State and Berlin. Race concludes by briefly hinting at the racism that plagued Owens' life following the 1936 Olympics. Although instances of racial discrimination appear throughout the film, Race ultimately allows audiences to interpret racism and white supremacy as issues of the past. But like the Jesse Owens story, the producers, director, and screenwriter are all white. The director, British-Australian Stephen Hopkins, intended for Race to resonate with modern-day audiences. He stated, "It will feel like a contemporary story. It's about a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, fighting his way to the forefront to represent his country." He also stated, "It should be something where people go, I can't believe this ever happened." Actor Jason Sudeikis, who plays the supporting role of Owens' coach Larry Snyder, and who is also white, described the biopic as a nice reminder how far we've come as a country and how far we need to go. Again, the filmmakers of Race relied heavily on the white savior motif to explain Owens' success. This time, the film gives recognition to Ohio State coach Larry Snyder, with guiding Owens on and off the track. As Huey explains, films that showcase strong, kind, messianic white characters assisting non-white, down-on-their-luck characters deliver just the right touch during moments of social change. By doing so, Race thus values the white coach's efforts in developing the young black protagonist's athletic skills, more than the trials and tribulations which the black protagonist had to endure. The film therefore reinforces the idea that without the help of the white man, the black man will be nowhere. With that comes the idea of what Parks, Piper, and Linden call bifurcated whiteness, which is a key theme in white savior narratives. This involves the juxtaposition of a good white character versus a bad white character. The contrast of a good white person versus a bad white person also allows viewers to distinguish only overt actions as racist or non-racist. This is a simplistic division that does not allow more subtle and institutionalized forms of racism to be labeled as such. Just as audiences could find comfort in Snyder's anger over segregation, they could also easily disassociate from the overt racism of the Nazi regime. The contrast between good Germans and bad Germans is very clearly outlined in Race, through the category of exclusive overt racism. For example, the most significant Nazi character in the film, Joseph Gobbles, is framed as a sinister architect searching for a path to power. The character is overly serious and demanding, characterized as the archetypal Nazi, well-dressed, calm, and racist with the utmost contempt for human life. In contrast, Leni Riefenstahl is depicted in a more favorable light. In the film, Riefenstahl defies Gobbles by showcasing Owens' greatness on film. Audiences therefore see Riefenstahl as resisting Gobbles and by extension the Nazi regime. In much the same way, Lutz Long, the German who ended second after Owens in the broad jump and supposedly befriended him during the Olympics, receives substantial airtime. In the film, he voices his criticism against the Nazis' supremacist ideologies. By including good Germans, the film softens the culpability of those living under evil leaders, past or present. Of course, the risk with doing that is that it makes the atrocities of the past more digestible to modern audiences who associate themselves with the good German, but disassociates themselves with the atrocities committed by the regime in which those good Germans flourish. In an era of continued racism with increased demonstrations of white supremacy, this is particularly dangerous. The film concludes with Owens and Snyder attending a banquet dinner in Owens' honor back home in the United States, but Owens and his wife are asked by the white doorman to use the service entrance because segregationist policy dictates that only whites may use the front entrance. As Owens and his wife get into a service elevator to attend the banquet, the screen fades to black and text on the screen informs the viewers that neither President Franklin D. Roosevelt nor the White House ever welcomed Owens after his victories. While some might understand it to mean that racism continued to harm African Americans regardless of their celebrity status, such ambiguity also allows for an interpretation that racism was an issue specific to the 1930s, but one that has since lessened. Additional text informs the audiences that President George H.W. Bush awarded Owens a Congressional Gold Medal in 1990, 10 years after he died. Therefore, this sequence in the film demonstrates clear images of progress as the audience learns that Owens is remembered as a hero. Despite him being humiliated in his lifetime, there has been progress during and after his life, which resulted in posthumous recognition. Therefore, white audiences grapple with racism, but it's located in the past, so they believe that progress has been made. Racial equality in the 20th century has been achieved. By locating racism in the past and placing emphasis on the progress that has been made since the 1930s, race runs the danger of dismissing contemporary, covert racism. In conclusion, we have seen the intimate relationship between visual rhetoric and myth-making. The image informs the audience of a specific truth, but by doing so it hides other truths. The ability of film to inform and bolster an audience's preconceived attitudes is both fascinating and disturbing. On the one end, it confirms the truths that audiences want to remain true. On the other hand, it dismisses other perhaps more significant truths. By doing so, history can be marginalized or completely forgotten, while another history is oversimplified. This oversimplification of history in itself is also dangerous. It can be utilized to maintain the systems of oppression by comforting those who benefit from that system. By informing audiences that racism and white supremacy are problems of the past, films which are meant to depict black heroes dismiss that such problems are still rampant in this day and age. This creates a fairy tale expectation, causing audiences to think, but racism and white supremacy is dead. Jesse Owens defeated them. As a result, it can potentially inhibit much needed dialogue between parties from across the racial lines. On the other hand, hopefully such films do spur conversations, but if those conversations are not oriented towards the right direction, then what is the point? Next time, we will be discussing one of history's darkest episodes, and how it is remembered. This episode is the Holocaust.